Good morning. We had two huge reports yesterday, and we kind of got buried in numbers yesterday, so pushed the video back to today. Reports were, of course, for the quarterly grain stocks, and then the big report was the acreage report. Starting with the stocks, not great numbers there. What do you want to say about that, Randy?
Well, no, they weren't. I mean, we did see, obviously with the numbers coming out, we did see more in the bins than what was anticipated. Corn stocks coming in at 4 billion. That was 120 more than expected by the trade. The trade was expecting that maybe exports or that feed demand's been a little more aggressive and that we'd see a little bit of a lower ending stock or lower stocks estimate. That was also 890 million bushels above last year. Now, it's likely USDA is going to have to come in and make some adjustments. And it's likely they're going to have to increase supply a little bit for corn to make these numbers work to show the bigger stocks estimate. But when you look at where the stocks are right now, 3/4 of the stocks are being held on farm, 1/4 are off farm. For soybeans, come in a little bit above expectations, not by much, but quite a bit larger than last year at 174 million bushels above. Those stocks are basically 50-50. Half is in farm, half is off farm. And as far as wheat is concerned, stocks again came in close to expectations, quite a bit higher than last year. But for wheat, it's just the opposite of corn. We're looking at about 1/3 of it being on farm, 2/3 of it being off farm.
And then again, this is what you went over, on-farm, off-farm numbers for, and this is all on both the app and the website if you want to take some time and look at the slides. Acreage report had some interesting numbers in it. Looking at the major crops, what struck out to you here?
Well, the biggest thing is corn acres being increased. Most were expecting them to be somewhat in line with the March estimate. Them coming in about a 1.2 above expectations, and then still 3 million less than last year. But when you compare it to what we were expecting in March, we were again about a little over 1 million higher. That tells us that our ending stocks estimate has to go up because production is going to go up. And that is what was kind of the bearish news in this market for the funds. They see it as more stocks, demand continues to be slow, and that's what kind of pressured the corn market a little bit. Soybeans, it actually was a decent report because we're actually looking at less acres, so we're going to look at a little bit tighter stocks. It'll offset the increase in the stocks that we saw from the quarterly grain stocks numbers. So it was a little bit on the neutral to friendly side as far as soybeans were concerned. And for wheat, it was a little bit friendly as we are looking at a lot less acres, or not a lot less, but less acres being planted than expected, primarily in the winter wheat side. And production is going to be up a little bit just because yield will likely increase in the next report. But we are going to see a little bit lower acres that'll help offset that. What also was surprising, was the durum number. Durum acres increasing as much as they did tells us that up here in the spring wheat country, guys went to durum over spring wheat because of the influence or the higher price.
And then we did have a 4.4 million drop in principal crop acres compared to last year. Were you expecting that?
Not really. I mean, everybody was looking for that, the principal crop acres to be, at least in line with last year. So now we have to look at where do those acres going. And right now, nobody's really coming with an explanation of where did we lose those 4 million acres to. Now, this doesn't show, of course, doesn't take into consideration, the prevent plant at this point. A lot of states were still planting when these numbers were being done. I believe there was still quite a bit of corn and soybeans left to be planted as of June 1. And it also doesn't take into consideration, of course, the rain events that have happened recently, which have caused a lot of drowned out. That likely won't be seen until the September-October report when we see an adjustment to harvested acres.
And then again, USDA started doing this report. As of when they surveyed all this, there were still 3.36 million acres of corn and 12.8 million acres of soybeans that were left to be planted. As for the principal crops, like we said, we had that acre drop a little bit compared to last year. Corn acres.
What's interesting here is when you look at the big states, we did see, Iowa virtually unchanged and from the previous year. I think they're a little bit more than what they were looking for in March. But in pretty much most of the states did see a little bit of a decline from, all of them did see a decline from last year. but it was mainly in the principal states.
And again, there's the acre showing the drop from last year. This is the percent change from the March estimate for acres. And so we saw quite a few states in the blue there where they were higher than March. But when you go to last year, there's a lot of red on that map where acres dropped compared to last year.
Yeah, and it shows that the producers weren't willing to plant the high dollar crop and spend the extra on the input costs, and soybeans were the ones that were penciling out and showing a little bit more of a return. So it stands to reason why we're seeing a little bit less corn than the previous year.
Moving on to soybeans, there we're seeing increases in the major states.
And pretty much most of what we saw as the decrease in corn, we're seeing as an increase in the soybeans. So it tracked fairly well. And it was a little bit interesting. And most were expecting to see a little bit more soybeans, and also because of the switch to renewable fuels, and soybean oil being a big part of that also helped to encourage more acres.
And then again, looking at that, see a little bit of acreage increase from last year. This was, again, the change from the March estimate. Red is a decrease, blue an increase. And then, of course, the opposite of corn. We look at compared to last year, and it's mostly blue on the map.
What's interesting is when you look at them, compared to March, there was some red states there that, up here in the Northern Plains, I'm surprised we didn't see more soybeans because of the wet conditions, the slow planting. But producers were looking at, because of an early start, we're looking at planting a little bit more corn or early crops. But Mother Nature kind of, I think, is going to turn that. And as we see the rest of the acres get planted, we might see some adjustment to acres, lower corn and a little bit higher soybeans.
Moving on to winter wheat, we talked about that a little bit before, that we're seeing a decline in acres there. And again, this is the percent change from March, and the percent from last year. There's even more red on that map than the corn map.
Yeah, just about every state that, other than Montana and Washington, that raised winter wheat saw a decrease. And, part of that, I think, is just because of the demand for wheat is so poor right now, and the fact that the prices just couldn't compete with other products.
Moving on to spring wheat. Of course, North Dakota is the number one producer of spring wheat in the country, but their acres were up from last year.
A little bit up from last year. We were expecting to see a little bit of a decrease. When we did see in the March report, USDA was expecting the big increase, though, to come in Minnesota and South Dakota. That's where in North Dakota was going to see a little bit lower acreage. It actually turned out to be the opposite. They actually weren't able to get their acres planted. North Dakota did.
And again, here's the map comparing to March and the map comparing to last year. Moving on to durum, anything stick out for you on the durum side?
I was surprised at as big of an increase in acres. We saw a huge increase, 30% in North Dakota, Montana, 25%. That's the two biggest states that raise it. Arizona and California are pretty much irrigated acres, but I was surprised to see North Dakota increase it as much as they did. And
again, putting that in chart form, that's a big increase over the last 2 years from 2022.
And with the premium that you get paid with durum, I can understand it. But last year we had better crop insurance prices for it. So in this year, I was kind of surprised this year they switched over.
Okay, now we're going to talk about some of the minor crops. Most of these saw an increase over last year. The big losers here were barley and sunflowers.
Barley saw a big drop in acres. I mean, you look at, almost, 20%, and then also seeing for sunflowers, acres almost being cut by a third. So we saw a big drop in some of those specialty crops. A lot of it is because there's a lot of barley sitting in storage. There's a lot of sunflowers sitting in storage, and producers weren't going to take the risk of raising those crops. I was surprised that canola acres didn't see a bigger increase. And then I'm surprised that dry beans saw as much of an increase as they did.
And canola acres, with that increase, that will be a new record for planted acres if that's realized. Sunflowers, if this is the right number, it will be the lowest acreage since 1976 for sunflowers in the U.S.
And you know,
And then
that's
again,
just before sunflowers took off big, was in that time frame. So yeah, that shows quite a bit of how producers are kind of switching away from some of those crops.
and again, this all the percent changes from the March estimate and from last year again. Like I said, this is on the website, this is on the app if you want to go through all those. Principal crops, no surprise here that corn and soybeans are by far the leading crops in the U.S.
It's not, you know, it's actually, this is an impressive chart to look at because it just shows how big corn and soybeans are when compared to everything else. And what's surprising is that hay takes a big part of the number as well. That's the third biggest crop, and then how small some of the other crops actually are.
Now, this is looking from planting intentions that changes from March. And again, we're seeing more corn acres, less soybean acres than the March estimates.
And not that corn acres seeing the increase is likely because of early planting and up here in some of the regions, and they were able to plant more corn just because it was quick. It was working to plant it, so they did. Durum wheat, same thing. Because we had an early spring, we were able to do that. Some of the later season crops is when it got wetter, and that's where we saw some of those start to fade off.
And again, this is a percent change from the acres last year. Chickpeas and durum wheat are the big winners there, and dry beans.
And chickpeas were low last year, so then a little bit of a recovery. And again, some of the guys out in the western part of the state are looking for an alternative crop to raise.
Anything else you want to add to sum all this up?
I guess I was a little bit surprised at the acres coming in. I figured we'd see a little bit more prevent plant than what we did. So that kind of surprised me. And where the acres bay or the combination went, I was surprised that we're still looking at quite a bit lower acres as far as the principal crops are concerned. It seems like we're probably waiting to see where those acres are going to come in, if they're going to come into the number form here at some point. And then the stocks estimate, I was kind of surprised at that. And it's going to be interesting to see how USDA adjusts the supply and the demand side going forward to make up for the more stocks or the increase in stocks.
And now with this out of the way, I suppose we just go back to watching weather this week coming up.
Weather is going to be the big important factor going forward right now. We're going into the 4th of July. Of course, that means that we're going to be looking at corn going into pollination in a lot of areas. Some of the early planting soybeans are going to be seeing some flowering and some potting going on here fairly soon. So yeah, weather is going to play a really big impact onto the marketplace going forward.
That's all we got. If you've got questions, this is how you get a hold of us. And thank you for watching.